Les habla René Salgado, presidente de la iniciativa Empresomos Centroamérica. Pueden encontrarnos en empresomos.org. Les damos la bienvenida a este intercambio de ideas sobre diásporas y desarrollo económico, que es parte de nuestro programa Empresomos Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica, que implementamos junto con CLATS de INCAE y CAMTIC. Las diásporas pueden apoyar a sus países de origen mediante remesas de dinero, usualmente familiares, así como con inversiones, con la transferencia de habilidades, conocimientos y tecnología. Sin embargo, la mayoría de los escritos y publicaciones sobre nuestros migrantes y diásporas suelen ser descriptivas o analíticas del tema de remesas monetarias, dejando una brecha en el enfoque más prescriptivo de cómo las diásporas nuestras pueden contribuir a las remesas de inversiones, conocimientos, habilidades o tecnologías, como es el caso de los diásporas de otros países y regiones. Esto otorga una relevancia particular al tema del diálogo de hoy, orientado a extraer lecciones de diásporas que apoyan inversión y transferencias o remesas de conocimientos y tecnología. Para discutir sobre diásporas y desarrollo, hemos invitado al doctor Aleksandr Gevorkyan y al doctor Daniel Prokop. El doctor Gevorkyan es un macroeconomista especializado en economía abierta, desarrollo económico, economía de la diáspora y economías de transición. Ocupa la cátedra Henry George en el Departamento de Economía y Finanzas del Peter Tobin College of Business de la Universidad de St. John en New York. Tiene un importante número de publicaciones entre libros y artículos sobre el tema de diáspora, redes de diásporas y desarrollo económico en revistas especializadas arbitradas y es miembro de los consejos editoriales de la Review of Political Economy y la Review of Canadian Economics. El doctor Prokop, por su parte, es profesor titular de Geografía Económica en la Universidad de Cardiff, Gran Bretaña. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en el desarrollo económico regional, especialmente en la intersección de la iniciativa empresarial, la innovación y las redes. Tiene numerosas publicaciones sobre el tema de desarrollo regional y recientemente coautoró el libro Ecosistemas empresariales en ciudades y regiones, publicado por Oxford University Press. En este diálogo se abordarán estos temas, entre otros, cómo algunas diásporas han contribuido al desarrollo económico de sus países de origen, transfiriendo tecnología, conocimientos e inversiones. ¿De qué manera se organiza la diáspora para impactar en el desarrollo económico de los países de origen? ¿Cómo influye la diáspora en la transferencia de prácticas empresariales, experiencias y habilidades para construir empresas mejores y más resilientes en los países de origen? ¿Qué importancia tienen las redes y asociaciones entre las comunidades de la diáspora y los empresarios, gobiernos e instituciones locales en el país de origen para facilitar el desarrollo económico? Y también se sacarán inferencias de tales experiencias. Iniciamos el evento con una presentación introductoria del doctor Gevorkyan, seguido de un intercambio de preguntas, respuestas y ideas con el doctor Prokop. Aunque el video de la conversación en inglés contiene subtítulos en este idioma, estos pueden ser configurados para ser leídos en español presionando el botón subtítulo y haciendo la correspondiente selección. Esperamos que este diálogo sea de provecho para toda nuestra audiencia. And thank you very much to our presenters. And you have the floor, Alec.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to start. So.
Thank you. So I think I will sort of lead with questions. So just generally, I think the important matter to start with is to understand what the diaspora is really, and why we should be looking at the diaspora. Could you tell us a bit more about that concept?
Sure. That's the simplest question, and it's the most difficult question. It has, as many other things in social sciences and in life, its own beginnings. These days, we refer to diaspora to an active group of expatriates who are interested in the life of their native countries, which they have left for various reasons. And the hope is that it's such an economically active group and also a patriotically sort of motivated group that they would be sort of willing to take the first step, become the first movers in their country's economic development, because usually we think about developing countries in this context, but we'll get to this point. It's not only that. That's a short answer, and there's a lot of hope around that concept of diaspora. But we have to be scientists and intellectuals a bit more careful, and in sort of using the generalizing rather the terms, and remember that diaspora has much bigger much bigger influence, much greater, can be defined in much more greater ways. The origins of the word go back to Greek word, and translating as dispersion of peoples away from a center home, sort of living outside of their homeland. And sort of for a very long time, this was a discussion within history, sociology, anthropology, those sort of sciences. Very little of that was going into economics or business. There were as one of the researchers, Robert Brubaker, mentioned that there were three classical diasporas: the Greek, the Jewish, and the Armenian diasporas. Just the sort of the groups that historically, over centuries, millennia, that have been crossing the worlds. These days, of course, as I gave you the short version of the interpretation of the word, these days it's much more compact understanding, but also this view of dispersion and life outside of a homeland applies to a lot of different groups. I can go on, so feel free to interrupt me. But essentially, there's the short understanding that it is something that is sort of in operational terms, a group of people motivated to connect with home but living outside. And there's a bigger sort of view, which is it's a multi-layered, very complex group of people, indeed outside of their homeland, but not necessarily related to any of the country today on the map. It may actually be even a group of people that draws its sort of definition of who they are from the depths of history. Fascinating things. So happy to talk about that.
Thank you. This is quite interesting and important, to set the scene for our conversation, because just to avoid many people confusing immigrants and diaspora, because this is not exactly the same terminology. It's Indeed, not the same meaning as well. So thank you. That was great. What I would like to ask you, just before we move on to talking about more economic issues, is just how big normally the diasporas are per country, and how do they constitute very large populations, or does it differ based on the nation represented by the diasporas?
Another excellent question, because there's no magic figure. It comes back to how operational this group becomes in connecting with their home, how they are intent on preserving their identities, the cultural identities, and that's sort of very important. So it can be a group of 10 people, it can be a group of millions of people, but even within a group of 10 people, there are going to be very important to observe this. There are going to be some significant differences on views. So I can't put a number on it, and in terms of averages, it gets even much more complicated, because there are attempts to estimate the diaspora as a proportion to existing countries, what we see today on the world's map, population, right? And you can find those numbers easily. Those numbers are not always accurate, because those numbers only look at the migration. So they only track the people who have recently, over the past 30 years, let's say, migrated from their home countries. So they're registered somewhere as migrants or foreign born. Again, by the way, migrants does not need to have a negative connotation. So foreign born population. But a more accurate approach, and much more complicated and very difficult methodologically, is to actually look beyond this and to say, well, as a second generation, let's say, living abroad, do you identify yourself with this country where you were born or with the country of your parents or your grandparents? And how strong is this identification for you personally? So if it is strong, have you, let's say the next step is, well, how do you connect with that homeland, that ancestral homeland that, again, your parents or grandparents had left, and maybe there is nothing there. And maybe all there is just one element in the home cuisine, what people make at home as family. And that's as far as that culture goes. But for others, it may actually be participation in community activities, religious activities, language schools, and so on and so on. This is that, you know, a number is an important figure, of course, in the different communities, but it comes back to how, I guess, the self-identity of individual.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting, especially as, you know, I'm thinking about even, you know, my own origins being Polish, you know, and having the diaspora in Poland and how outside of Poland, how it operates. I know there are loads of, you know, there was loads of immigration of Polish people to the US and so on. And how that works, I could never figure that out. But I know that they all do vote in elections.
In Poland.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, so Poland has done good, sort of has taken important steps towards connecting with its diaspora, really. Including the global Pole ID card some time ago, maybe 15 or so years ago, there was an attempt to something like that. Yes.
There's some interesting stuff to hear. I was never engaged in the topic much, even though I'm just an immigrant.
But that's the idea. That's the idea, is to see how, again, to how you can attract, how a country can attract this immigrants' potential, right? So immigrants leave the country, but it is important to, I think, emphasize is that immigrants leave the countries of their origin in somewhat of a prepared way. And this is where we get into economic development and your field, economic geography. So not, you know, educational system is not the same everywhere, right? And so some countries may have a very strong educational system or legacy educational system that offers enough, trains a person enough to pick up almost any trade once they are abroad, right? Not to lose themselves, and then start moving up. And I think that is one of the, we're deviating a little bit, but to me, what I've been noticing in terms of these outcomes is that seems to be very strong in Eastern European migration in general, and the products of Eastern European migration in Western Europe, in the US, have that they leverage that background very strongly, and it helps them to move up.
Which I think is a nice, thank you, Ali. This is a nice segue for us to talk about the economic development issue, since we're talking about the skills of the labor force in a way, or the sort of immigrant labor. So what is the range of economic impacts a diaspora may have on their own home country, or the country they identify with? In terms of, you know, what kind of different channels of impact could there be?
It is so vast, is as vast and as diverse as the concept of diaspora as well. So specifically, though, of course, we can think of targeted projects in each sphere, sort of in culture, in education, and investment into sort of business development, but also infrastructure. And very often, when we talk, let's say, about high-level business, something major, it may often become a conversation where a country is trying to, especially a developing country, is trying to present itself in a very sort of positive way to the diaspora from an investor point of view, a very standard approach, sort of, you give us $100 million and we turn it around, we give you back, for example, $200 million. And the diaspora investor might reply by saying that, look, I've earned all the money I wanted for myself, but tell me how my investment helps advance the economy. right? So I will give the money, I will even maybe take a loss or at best break even. But if I know that my money went towards providing clean water to the villages, towards a better school system, take it. And it's not a guarantee, but it often happens. And I've seen those conversations, and to me that was like, whoa, this is incredible. Of course, I'm talking about exceptional cases. These are people speaking from really comfortable positions, right? So aside from these high-level sort of projects, they're everyday sort of interactions. The most basic one that, and one of the reasons actually why we started to pay so much attention to the concept of migration, it started with remittances, really. The labor migrant remittances, the monetary transfers sent back home. At a certain point, they crossed the 100 billion psychological mark of $100 billion sometime 20 years ago, and up to 600 billion or so these days on the global scale. And the amount of transfers into each country are significant, right? So we're talking within the Central American context, the numbers are close to something 20% of GDP or even greater, right? So it varies. Oh yes, I looked up some data. It varies, and the numbers are in billions. So I looked up that, for example, for Honduras, it was 27%, for El Salvador, 24%, in 2022. So these are a significant amount of transfers. I'll come back to this point in a moment because I'd like to list other examples of economic impact, right? So the high-level projects that are diaspora-driven, these are the first movers. They're sort of the path breakers as far as the international community is concerned. They come in and they say, we want here to be a factory producing, what is a popular topic these days? Microchips. So we will build it here. Right? So here's the money. It is possible, it is very rare, but it is possible and it has happened. Another is the remittances that goes to individual families. Related to remittances is a process of transfers which is a little bit more organized, and again, Philippines, Moldova. Well, I try to not to mention too many countries because then I'm afraid I'm omitting some of them. But Philippines, Moldova, Mexico, for example, they have developed with the government and actually with some multilateral agencies' participation, a process, financial channels by which these remittances are pooled into one fund and then go towards specific needs in the specific area. Again, this is mostly from the labor migration process, not necessarily this over sort of a greater sort of concept of diaspora, because then there's another layer of complexity, right? The labor migrants contribute at a smaller scale, but on the more regular level. And the money goes towards individual families. The question is, how is the money spent? In terms of poverty alleviation, it's a massive support and helped raise a lot of families out of poverty. But is that, so to speak, is that a net positive result for the country in macroeconomic terms? What often happens is that a family supported by a migrant eventually joins the migrant in the immigration, right? So then the country loses that income. In other words, it's not necessarily such a reliable. This is why the sort of the frameworks that provide a more pooled or collective sort of spending are, in my opinion, are much stronger. Let's see what else they can do. In more broadly, in economic terms, in economic development terms, there is also an opportunity to invest and develop in culture development, but also educational development, right? So we see different diasporas sponsoring schools, universities, or engaging with local scientists and so on. again, I can go on. You feel free to interrupt me because there are many examples.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question in a way, just to specify which came from Renee. Is it possible to identify diasporas that are effective at transferring technology and knowledge to economic development? And if you could highlight perhaps, 2 or 3 things that examples that when this happened.
If you are interested in history, then sure, there's the Indian diaspora, the Jewish diaspora. There are attempts right now.
More recent examples, maybe?
This is all recent. The Irish diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, starting with the 90s, right? The Irish is very active these days as well, continuing. So much of the country's economic miracle actually has been played a role. But each individual, what is interesting about there are examples, but what is important about these examples is that they're so individual. There's one thing that I think unites them all, in my very biased opinion, and that is the engagement from the country that is receiving diaspora input or diaspora capital, whatever it might be. So, in fact, what we have just talked about in the past few minutes, we started with identity, right? So how people identify themselves. Do they see any commonality? Do they see any sameness sort of in the person from the same country as they are, right? And that then leads us to the next step, and that is the trust. Who do they trust most? Do they trust each other to work together to come up and establish a diaspora organization? Or do they remain just individual migrants sending remittances individually to their families and only interacting with each other on the basis of the need, sort of sometimes maybe looking for a job or some sort of casual encounter. In other words, nothing formal. There's no structure behind it. But when we cross into the structure, we're talking about some type of a trust, maybe based on identity, maybe based on sort of origin from a common village or rural area. Most recently, we're talking about rural areas. And then this group may make a first step, but nothing is guaranteed towards a country of their origin or their homeland. But then really sort of going back to the question, what are the commonalities? It really is up to the country to first open up. It's not that simple, but to open up to receive this external flow of funds, and most importantly, external flow of ideas, right? And then provide conditions or create conditions for these diaspora members to continue working in the country. This is why when you asked me about the definitions, I gave you a short definition, but then I said it's actually a much more complex term. This is why it's not so simple to just, I guess, make it so operational. Sort of, we have a diaspora, we have a number, there are estimates on the numbers by each country, and that's the potential. Maybe it only becomes a potential if you actually engage with it. So much weight and pressure is on the country.
That's a very good thing to say, actually, because we may have all these people there, but if we don't,
they live their own lives,
them,
right? Yeah, they're living their lives. They're establishing. It's not that simple to live in immigration. Every day you have to, right? Every day you are proving to yourself and to everyone around you that, well, not necessarily proving, but kind of going through the process of reestablishing yourself. Right? Everything is new, no matter how long you've lived. Yes, Renee. Unmute.
Renee, you're muted.
One brief question, Alec. What is it that countries that are getting prepared, or regions that are getting prepared to accept those technology transfers, knowledge transfers have done? I mean, is there like a pattern, or is, or only individual cases? How does it work? Because I mean, after all, they are the ones that, have to accept those conditions and the effective transfers. I mean, it happens on the ground, so to speak. So how are there any things that you have found in your research that may be useful as a
Yeah. So there are competitive forces within the country that may not want the diaspora entrepreneurs to be coming in, right? Because it is all about sharing the market. So I think the first step is for the receiving government, the home country, that's what we'd call it, right? To prepare the competitive sort of field to say that here, these are actually transfers that are going to benefit you, local producers, local manufacturers, and such. And let's try to integrate them within our economy, so that oftentimes, and those groups could be very powerful, right? Lobbying is now a form of conducting politics across the world. So those groups could be quite powerful. And that's what I meant by a government being open and ready to receive these entrepreneurs, because these people come with high hopes, right? And one small misstep in bureaucratic terms could turn that whole capital inflow away. So in more sort of schematic terms, maybe think in the following way. What is it that the diaspora entrepreneurs or sort of specialists, experts are willing and ready to offer, right? How's that, let's say, product or skill or technology developed, or how does it even exist within the country? Is there any infrastructure for that? Right. So at each step, there needs to be some careful analysis and preparation. Suppose there is some work on that being done in the country, but the next step is, well, how relevant is it on the global sort of scale, or would it help local economy internally, sort of for the domestic market, or is it something that sort of the diaspora entrepreneurs are bringing that can help the country move up in the global value chain? But it all sort of, think of this as a wave of things approaching, and then it hits the shore, it hits the rocks, and the rocks are the engagement infrastructure that the government is willing to provide.
So Alec,
tax benefits.
Would you say then that there's a very big role for the formal institutional context in a country, then that there's a big role for government to play? Is it central government that is predominantly playing the role, or is this local authority or local government level also can engage quite?
It can be always. The local level is very interesting. There are some examples of that. And that's where, indeed, sort of for a small town, small village to benefit from diaspora entrepreneurial potential, there needs to be a point person, someone who sort of is a liaison between the local community and the, say, hometown association, which is built by migrants somewhere abroad. But again, for the recently created diasporas, or countries that have recently discovered the concept of diaspora, things are relatively easy to capture these days, because they are relying on the potential of recent migrants, people who still have memory and some type of ties with the country that they've left, right? So there is relatively speaking, there's an easier way of engaging and connecting with them. It is much more difficult for countries to connect with second, third, fourth generation of people who live in wherever they were born. They live in those countries as sort of with dual identities. At home, they belong to one group, but outside there's something else. And it's natural that there's no conflict between the two identities, by the way, which is another thing. It's natural integration. and they would be interested in visiting the ancestral homeland, but it's not really clear how. So that brings me back to engagement infrastructure, where the country's government explains, okay, dual citizenship path, or voting, participate in country's elections, or if you bring your business or you come work from our coffee shops, right? And there needs to be some monetary benefit, of course, these days. we'll give you tax breaks, or we'll give some other incentives. Again, my imagination is maybe limited, but there can be many different incentives to that. But with migrants, going back to more practical things again, it's much easier. For example, a lot of people want to go back, but while living abroad, they've acquired a new profession. So what a country can do, the home country, is to establish a process by which returning migrants, right, are receiving some type of recertification. So you received your education from us in economics 20 years ago. Now you're coming back as a philosopher, for example. All right, you have dual certification, and which simplifies the path towards finding jobs, right, locally. So,
Alec, I was wondering how do diasporas, in a way, how do they work for, improving the entrepreneurial activity in the home or ancestral lands? How what do they do? How do these connections work? How do they need to be employed in order to improve the entrepreneurial rates, the rates of startups and so on?
So I think there's a lot, going back to your point, on the institutional aspect, because many of these entrepreneurs, they come back with slightly different, I'm not saying it's necessarily better, I'm just going to say different way of doing things, right? Sometimes better, sometimes it could be a little bit out of context and depending on the country. So that is important, because if they come in as an investor, right, as a business manager or business owner, they sort of get to set the rules on that smaller scale, and others who work for them have to somehow adapt, probably. But it also puts these people into interaction with the local community, with local businesses. And it's a slow process, but it is through that sort of back and forth of, well, we do public announcements and we don't do public announcements about what we do. And somehow, well, let's probably have just an informal gathering and talk about things and invite investors for coffee, or our shareholders. I don't know, I'm just making things on the way, but essentially it's through that formal and informal interactions. And I think that's the way how they sort of, or demanding, another example, demanding certain paperwork to be done in a certain way. Let's make an agreement. Okay, we have coffee and we've agreed, shake hands. No, let's put it on paper, right? So formalizing. And the next you know that then the local business person, now meeting with another local business person, also asks for a paper and a way of formalizing things. So it's that. But again, they don't really have an influence unless they're represent like 20% of country's investment or GDP. Mm-hmm. They can't really influence policy much.
Yeah. So from what you say, in a way, it seems like it's something that we always talk about in economic geography. There's a big importance of culture and yes, there's cultural differences, because as you said, the population of recent migrants, they may still be culturally more connected to their homelands, but the diasporas that have been born abroad, their culture may be very different than the ancestral land, and that aspect seems to become far more critical from what you say.
Right.
Which is, I think, something very important for the nations that want to connect with the diasporas to remember, to be wary of. I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned a number of times something that is very close to my research, basically, which is networks. Networks are incredibly important here because I can see that there needs to be a connection. There needs to be a connection between the ancestral land and the diasporas, wherever they are. And this connection is pretty much the only thing that will make things work. And now, from what you said, and you know, it seems like the policy aspect, the government's role is incredibly important to develop these connections. But I just wanted to ask you, you may not have an answer to that, but
I'll try.
It will be okay.
Yeah. Okay.
But what if the government doesn't engage, for example, that doesn't have any, you know, active policy program for engaging with diasporas? What could the individuals do outside of that kind of sphere, you know, more informally, more on their own, when the government, for example, you know, you probably heard about the topic of institutional voids. Sometimes the institutions are lacking, and sometimes, you know, the entrepreneurs, or, you know, they have to operate outside of that aspect. So do you have any sort of examples, or, you know, of how this could work in practice?
Yeah, so most of my examples that I know of are actually the opposite. The governments wake up and they jump into this. And in literature, there's even a term, discovery of diasporas, sort of, because it's common, and I'm blanking on the researcher's name, but it's so common now. Again, I mentioned Ireland, but also Scotland. Scotland has one of the best diaspora engagement statements that they put out last year or so, a diaspora report, or New Zealand as well. Again, we tend to associate the term diaspora migration with sort of least developed countries and that are struggling economically in institutional terms, but it is quite obvious that actually more and more countries are seeing diaspora as something, as an almost as an instrument towards, again, further progress these days. But what if they don't do anything? So for a very long time, since roughly, I think, again, I'm really bad with the years, roughly around 1950s or so, or maybe a little bit later, India would pretty much say, okay, we're close to the sort of people of Indian origin living outside. And it only took the processes of 1990s. And I think also, as a researcher in Eastern Europe, I think the end of Cold War, or what we call what's known as Cold War period, played a massive role in opening up the concept of diaspora, because again, in Eastern Europe, all of a sudden, each country started looking into this. Even Estonia has a program for Global Estonian, which a country is less than of 2 million people. So again, all of my examples are about where countries actually do something. But if they don't do, then I think we end up with just the enthusiasts who are sort of naively motivated for certain things, and that individual level of connection, which is through migrants. Now, this is where your question about the numbers becomes very important, because even if it's just individual migrants, but there's 4 million of them, 10 million of them outside, these people come into contact with each other, or if it's even in tens of millions, let's say Mexican diaspora is almost 40 million, right, in the United States. Then these people start to form some type of structures, institutional structures. And in fact, it's Mexican example, and the example of Mexican migrants, which eventually turned into diaspora, is that the world is actually learning from about the hometown associations and connection with communities that they had left, or they were from in Mexico, and supporting them, right? And that is when, again, and this is similar, again, Mexico and India are similar in this, because in India with the Silicon Valley it again was a sort of before countries' comprehensive diaspora sort of approach or program development. You have in India people, professionals from Silicon Valley, leveraging India's, let's say, educational system and English language, and starting with basic tech projects, including call center, as simple as call centers, then into consultancies, right? And then gradually building up so that then the government turns its weight sort of towards this process, saying that, oh, this has actually grown. But that's where there's power of numbers, right? Because there's so many, in both cases, Mexico and India, there's so much of both monetary transfers, people moving back and forth, businesses being set up. Whereas in the scale of a smaller country, it may not be as sizable, not as noticeable. So for me, it's hard to generalize again on this, but that's why I say, if you think you have a diaspora, learn what it is, research it, and then try to engage it.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of move on to sort of talking a bit more about topics that may be closer to Central America.
Yeah,
which
of course. Go ahead.
Some lessons that come from your research, for other nations, because
Okay.
I know you wrote quite extensively about Armenia's diaspora, and I read your work with great interest. It was quite impressive to read that. Some of this activity can stimulate foreign direct investment back into the ancestral country, which as someone who used to teach a bit about foreign direct investment, it was quite eye-opening. That's a massive impact. In terms of based on your research and your studies, what would you say are sort of like the top 3 most important aspects, that any country, could learn from these diaspora's activities, in terms of trying to start up and stimulate economic activity based on diasporas?
Okay. Number 1, don't assume everybody loves you. In other words, it's not a guarantee that someone with the same last name as yours, let's say, is sort of eager to move or something like that. And related to that, don't expect everyone to actually move. Some countries prioritize repatriation or it is actually an immigration, and it's a cultural shock. So don't expect people to do that, but instead, and that is still number 1, focus on engagement, right? So focus on developing engagement. So, which is done, and I forgot my number 2. But I think that's a start, right? Number 2 is to create the conditions for someone to actually engage, and what I mean by engage is someone to, let's say, come for a short visit or explore a country and sort of understand whether or not they can do anything here or what they can do here. It may be as minor as we're academics, so as minor as coming to a country for a conference, for example. And well, the third one could be, so how do we engage them? No, the question is, your question was,
what are the 3 most important things that a country can do to engage with the diasporas?
Right. So the first is, in a joking way, but really seriously, it is to understand the diversity of the diaspora. The second is to create the preconditions, and the third is that's the point. And the third is to tirelessly and endlessly, sort of continuously work with the diaspora. In other words, do not assume that it is a static sort of entity. It is a very much dynamic and live entity and transforming group of people almost daily, right? This is what is, I think, missing in a lot of the proposals out there and discussions. They tend to be somewhat schematic, what I'm saying by sort of identifying these 3 points, especially the third one, this continuous work, is that engaging diaspora requires constant adaptation, which means that the country that is actually putting itself towards, okay, let's work with diaspora, is also ready to accept diaspora's input. Because especially if we're talking about those who have, even if it's from recent migration, but have lived abroad for a very long time, people come with their opinions, people come with their ideas, and they want to be heard. They want to feel that they've been heard and that what they've said has been implemented. It does not mean blindly accepting what people are saying, but at least have a forum for discussing these topics. So it's not a simple thing. It requires some degree of institutional maturity, right? So
definitely looks like.
But maybe to simplify these things is to also have a clear idea. Maybe that's in the second point, a clear idea where the diaspora's input is most needed, because guidance is another very important factor. So it doesn't just happen blindly. Okay, there's an empty patch of land, let's build a factory. No, how does this fit into the country's economic development model? But that's just me.
Yeah, thank you. These are really great. Just another question which sort of partly follows on from this, which is if we think, about, let's say there is an entrepreneur somewhere in Central America, and they're trying to build their business, and they're looking at, okay, I need to build my networks, connect with potential, I don't know, investors or potential partners, from the diaspora elsewhere. What would you sort of prescribe to them how to build their networks with the diasporas? Because I think it's not we talk about networks and these connections. I know in Presomos there's a lot of that, exactly that step. And how can this lonely entrepreneur do that? Can he identify the diasporas online somehow? Do they organize in some more formal units?
Yep. These days it's way easier than before. It's almost like using a library these days is so much simplified, although it gets overwhelming, because in the past you had the index cards and sort of, okay, here's what I need. There's just one book. But these days, this same title could have, the search brings you 10 books or thousands of books, and you might get lost which one to choose. Similar thing here, because social media is number one, right? So a lot of groups self-organize that way. Somebody starts a group and then others start joining, and before you know it, it's a group of 100,000 people, and new connections start to happen. But what would be, again, much of a burden but logical is, let's say, for this individual to look up information on his or her country's consulate website, right, and find some information there. Or maybe there's a diaspora agency set up in that country which provides that information. It is very rare, but some countries have tried this, but it's again, going to the third point that I mentioned, it requires constant work. So it comes back to funding. So practical steps are social media, of course, and there are many ways how these connections can happen. That's what comes to mind. Local community, sort of things like that.
Thank you. That's really great. I mean, when you mentioned, just looking at the consulate's website, I thought to myself, yeah, there are some obvious ways that probably people don't think of.
But
I think it's great to mention them. Yeah.
So, as long as they're updated, as long as they're in the 21st century.
Yeah. So if you were thinking, because a lot of this relies on, from what you were saying, a lot of these engagements rely on the institutional context. So is there perhaps one, major policy, that you would think that works reasonably universally that you could recommend to follow,
One policy that works.
Yeah. It's a
Wow.
difficult one.
We will uncover a secret to, the wealth of nations in this. I mean, it varies again. To which extent the diaspora could be a significant factor in the country. For some countries, it doesn't really matter as much, or there's not much of a connection. I think I tried to look into that some time ago when I was working on the Transition Economies book, and I was trying to figure out, well, to what extent the Eastern European countries, former Soviet Union countries, have diaspora policies, and so the obvious then step is to actually, for a country that considers diaspora to be an important factor or potential important factor, is to create a dedicated task force group or something that actually has active sort of staff and experts working on the topic, rather than relying on sort of, well, whoever comes, they come approach. It should be a little bit more proactive. Maybe that's the words we should use, a bit more proactive sort of policy from the country point of view. Because again, we have to always remember that most of the time, diaspora will be approaching its sort of the task, the positioning that we place when we these days, and especially international business, when we talk about diaspora, members of diaspora approach this task from a very different viewpoint than we as researchers or policymakers have. Right? We might think that these guys are going to sort of be jumping in, but they're very risk-averse investors, put it this way.
Thank you. And perhaps the last question, what do you see the future trends for diasporas, over the next decade or so, in terms of contribution to economic development?
Yeah, I mean, for now, I'm positive in terms of, I think it's going to be growing. One reason for that is, well, again, we're going back to the identity questions. And part of it is social media, of course, is what helps shape the identity and access to resources and people discovering their cultures and so on. And from that comes sort of the desire to be helpful and useful, engaging with the groups. A lot of people will sort of feel kind of disconnected in the first time period of that, because there may be some negative experiences and so on. But those who continue and stay on may become sort of impactful investors, and the greater accessibility and the easier it is becoming to access different countries, even if remotely, and the easier is the knowledge transfer becomes. I think we'll see more and more of that type of activity. But this is where, again, comes back to the engagement infrastructure of the country to become entrepreneurial itself and sort of all-encompassing. In other words, being able to accept all offers, and sort of, as I wrote some time ago about Armenia, to allow sort of development through diversity of different initiatives. That is the view for now, I think.
Thank you so much, Alek. I mean,
Thank you.
It's really great to learn more about this.
I'm glad. Thank you.
It really looks like this is a sort of a missed opportunity for many countries to engage more with the diaspora, rather than just ignore them because they left, or because they there's a group of people that have been living somewhere else for so many years. We should forget about them, but clearly we shouldn't, and those links seem very, very important. Over to René.
No, thank you very much, Alek. This has been really illuminating, huh? And what I liked it was that there were a number of practical questions about this, about lessons and practices, etc., that may be helpful for those people that want to do something in terms of the relationship between their own diasporas and economic development of their own regions or countries, or etc. So I'm going to switch again to Spanish, to say, hello and bye to our audience, and let me do that.
Okay.
Bueno, le agradecemos profundamente al doctor Gevorkyan y al doctor Prokop por este enriquecedor intercambio de ideas sobre diáspora y desarrollo económico dentro del marco de nuestro programa Somos Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica, pleno de ideas para los interesados en atraer a las diásporas al desarrollo regional. Queremos expresar también nuestro agradecimiento a la audiencia, a nuestra audiencia por su atención, y les animamos a seguir explorando temas relacionados con el desarrollo emprendedor en la región centroamericana, suscribiéndose a nuestro canal de Somos en YouTube. Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.